In the aftermath of the flood, Emily watched in disbelief as a small raccoon dragged a heavy sack through the muddy street. Neighbors scoffed it off as garbage, but that strange journey unraveled an unbelievable story. Lost treasures returned, a boy pulled from raging waters, and a broken town bound together again. In the end, the raccoon carried home not just food, but a sense of belonging for lost hearts. The night had been long, filled with the hollow groans of shifting trees and the distant crash of river water tearing at its banks. When morning finally broke, Emily Carter pushed open the warped front door of her small rental house and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of mud and wet timber, and the streets of her new neighborhood lay heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the occasional hammer from a neighbor already starting repairs. She tightened the old denim jacket around her shoulders and stared out across the street at the ruin left behind. She had only moved to this little Arkansas town 3 months earlier, trading the crowded streets of Little Rock for what she thought would be a slower, steadier life. A place to patch herself back together after her divorce. A place where she might find a sense of quiet. But the storm had changed everything. The river had risen and poured into the low streets, turning the quiet town into a half-drowned skeleton. Furniture floated in ditches, children's toys were lodged in tree branches, and broken shingles littered the yards like fallen leaves. Emily had known storms before, but this one had stripped the town bare. Her neighbors, most of whom she had only greeted in passing before the flood, now moved like ghosts. A woman across the street picked through a pile of soaked clothes. A man with a chainsaw dragged a tree limb off his roof. Nobody had the energy for conversation, and Emily, still new, felt too much like an intruder to walk over and offer help. She wrapped her arms tight and whispered to herself, "So this is home now." The words felt thin. Just then, movement caught her eye. At first she thought it was another branch carried by the current, but it stopped, shifted, and revealed itself. Her breath caught. A raccoon, soaked through, its ringed tail dragging in the mud, staggered across the flooded road. She had seen plenty of raccoons before in city alleyways, raiding dumpsters or scurrying across fences, but this one was different. It was hauling something heavy. In its small paws and clenched jaws, the raccoon clutched the corner of a burlap sack. The bag was too large for it, dragging awkwardly across the mud. The animal grunted, pulling with determined effort step by step, as though it had a destination in mind. Emily blinked hard, unsure whether grief and fatigue were making her see things. The sight was almost comical, this scrappy little survivor waddling with a burden twice its size. But there was nothing funny about the stubborn purpose in its eyes. Her first thought was that it had dragged someone's garbage and was heading for a hiding spot. That would have made sense. But then she noticed. The bag wasn't spilling trash. It stayed shut, tied with a thick cord, its weight solid. The raccoon stopped for a breath, shifted its grip, then marched on again with surprising resolve. It wasn't scavenging, it was carrying. Emily leaned against the porch railing, frozen. She thought of stepping inside, shutting the door and pretending she hadn't seen it. But the longer she watched, the stronger the pull of curiosity grew. What on earth could be inside that sack? And why, of all creatures, would a raccoon risk dragging it across the broken street in broad daylight, with people watching? From the corner of her eye, she noticed an elderly woman standing on her porch down the block, her hands on her hips. The woman muttered, almost amused, "That little rascal again." Then she disappeared back inside without another word. Emily's pulse quickened. Again. That meant someone had seen this raccoon before, maybe many times. The thought sent a ripple of wonder through her. She felt oddly compelled, as if the animal had invited her into some secret. The raccoon pressed forward, paws splashing through shallow puddles, the bag scraping loudly behind. A few more neighbors glanced out their windows, but no one stopped it. Some chuckled, shaking their heads as though this were nothing new. Emily, however, couldn't look away. She knew she should be helping clean, making herself useful, blending in with the people she hoped one day to call neighbors. Instead, she felt her legs carrying her down the steps, across the wet yard, and into the street. She trailed after the raccoon, careful not to get too close. Her boots sank into the mud, and her breath puffed in the cool morning air. Every few steps, the animal stopped, adjusted its hold, and made a low, chittering sound, half complaint, half determination. Each time, Emily froze in place, heart thudding, afraid it might notice her. But it never ran. It only looked around, sniffed the damp air, then pushed on with its impossible load. As she followed, something inside her stirred. She had been adrift since moving here, adrift in the quiet after years of noise, in the empty space left by her broken marriage. Watching this drenched little creature wrestle with its burden, step by stubborn step, she felt an odd sense of recognition. Life had battered it too, yet here it was, carrying something important through the wreckage. By the time they reached the corner of the block, Emily realized she had left behind her sense of hesitation. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was invested. Whatever lay inside that heavy sack, she needed to see it. And deep down, she knew this wasn't just about the raccoon. This was about her own need to believe that in the middle of ruin, something worth carrying still remained. The raccoon did not slow its pace as it trudged down the ruined street, dragging the heavy sack through puddles and broken shingles. Emily followed at a distance, her boots slipping in the mud, her heart thumping with a strange mixture of fear and wonder. Every few feet, the animal stopped, adjusted its grip with its nimble black paws, and gave a quick, chattering sound as though grumbling about the weight. Then it set off again, shoulders hunched, tail dragging low. Emily could not shake the feeling that this was no ordinary raccoon. She had seen plenty in her time, back when she lived in the city. They were mischievous creatures, sure, often prowling trash bins or scaring cats off porches. But they were always creatures of the night, darting into shadows at the first sign of people. This one was different. It was out in broad daylight, under the eyes of half the neighborhood, and it behaved as if it had a clear destination, as though it carried something important. As she trailed behind, a screen door squeaked open 2 houses down. A man with a gray beard and a bent back shuffled out, balancing a bucket of rainwater. He caught sight of the raccoon and let out a chuckle. "Well, look who's at it again," he said, shaking his head. His voice carried in the damp air. "That rascal never gives up." Emily slowed, curious. "You know that raccoon?" she called, careful to keep her tone casual. The man squinted at her, then gave a small nod. "We call him Scout. Been around for years. Smartest pest you'll ever meet. Steals corn from my garden, snatched my grandson's ball once, and wouldn't give it back till we traded him a sandwich." He chuckled again, but then grew more thoughtful. "But he's more than trouble. Folks round here tell stories about him, how he shows up when someone's in need. Crazy, I know. But after a flood like this, who's to say what's crazy anymore?" Emily managed a polite smile, though she felt her pulse quicken. Scout. The name suited the animal with its determined march and searching eyes. She turned back just in time to see the raccoon pause at the corner, sit up on its hind legs, and glance back over its shoulder. For one dizzying moment she swore its gaze met hers. The look wasn't fearful, nor was it hostile. It was sharp, measuring, as if the creature was deciding whether to allow her to keep following. Then, just as quickly, Scout dropped back onto all fours, seized the bag again, and resumed dragging it down the next block. Emily picked up her pace. Her boots splashed through a wide puddle, soaking her socks, but she didn't care. Something about this strange chase had wrapped around her, pulling her deeper. She wanted, needed, to know what lay inside that burlap sack. The street they moved along was one of the hardest hit. Windows were boarded or shattered, porches half collapsed. A toppled mailbox lay in the gutter. A battered bicycle leaned crooked against a fence. The silence of the neighborhood pressed down, broken only by the scrape of the bag and the soft splash of Scout's paws. A sudden sound made Emily jump. From behind one of the houses, a dog barked furiously, straining against a chain. Scout stopped, ears pricked, but did not run. Instead, the raccoon let out a high-pitched trill, almost playful, then deliberately hauled the bag a little farther along, as if mocking the dog's inability to follow. The dog barked harder, but Scout ignored it, eyes fixed on his unseen goal. Emily found herself laughing quietly, despite the tension. The little creature had spunk, that much was certain. Mischief clung to him, even as he wrestled with his burden. As they reached the far end of the block, Emily saw an older man standing in his yard, clearing fallen branches. He wore a faded navy cap and leaned heavily on a cane. When he noticed Scout, he set his cane down and lifted a hand in greeting, as though spotting an old friend. "Well, I'll be still kicking, eh, Scout?" His voice was warm, tinged with familiarity. Emily stopped a few steps away, hesitant to intrude. The man's eyes flicked to her, kind but curious. "You new around here?" he asked. "Yes," she said quickly. "Emily Carter. Just moved in before the flood." "Name's Harris," he replied, tapping his cap. "Everyone knows that critter. Smart as a whip, too. One time, he dragged half a loaf of bread straight out of my kitchen when I left the window open. Left the wrapper behind like a calling card." "And yet—" He trailed off, watching Scout wrestle the sack onto the curb. "Somehow, when he shows up, trouble seems to ease. Folks say he's got a nose for people who need help." Emily looked back at the raccoon, who was now pausing to tug stubbornly at a knot in the cord of the bag, his little hands working with startling precision. She shook her head slowly. "That's incredible." Harris shrugged. "Believe what you want. Me, I've seen enough strange in this world not to laugh too hard." He gave her a wry smile, then returned to his branches. Emily lingered, her eyes drawn to the sack. She could make out faint bulges beneath the wet fabric. Something solid, not soft trash. Scout managed to grip the top and heave it forward again, though the effort nearly toppled him. With a grunt, he adjusted and pressed on, determined. Her curiosity burned hotter now. Whatever was inside that bag mattered, at least to him. She found herself leaning forward, almost whispering, "Where are you taking it?" The raccoon didn't answer, of course, but when it scurried ahead, dragging its strange prize toward the far end of the street, Emily followed, step by step, drawn deeper into the mystery. And though she didn't know it yet, that simple choice, to follow a mischievous raccoon with a heavy bag, was about to change everything she thought she knew about this battered little town, and about herself. Scout lumbered on, dragging the sodden burlap sack with a kind of stubborn rhythm, and Emily stayed a dozen steps behind, her boots squishing in the mud. She had stopped wondering whether she should be doing something else, helping her neighbors, cleaning her porch, or unpacking boxes that still sat untouched in her living room. None of that mattered now. All that mattered was this peculiar little raccoon and the mystery he carried. Halfway down the block, Scout paused in front of a sagging white fence. An old man stood behind it, leaning on a cane and wearing a navy cap faded nearly to gray. He had been picking branches out of his yard, stacking them in uneven piles. The raccoon chirped, almost like greeting an old friend, and the man chuckled low in his throat. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Scout's back at it again." Emily hesitated, unsure if she should stop. The man waved a hand in her direction. "Don't look so spooked, young lady. He's not going to bite you. That rascal's been stealing from me for years." Emily took a cautious step closer, watching Scout adjust his grip and haul the bag another foot. "You know him?" she asked. "Know him?" The old man snorted. "Name's Harris, retired Navy. I've seen storms at sea that'd curl your hair, but nothing rattles me quite like that critter. He's been around these parts near 10 years. Folks just got used to him." He leaned on the fence, his eyes following Scout with something like affection. "Stole half my garden last summer. Took my wife's pie right off the windowsill once. But," his voice softened, "when my wife took a bad fall last winter, I swear to you, that raccoon made a ruckus out front until a neighbor came running. Saved her life, or close enough." Emily blinked, unsure if the story was a tall tale. Harris caught her look and gave a toothy grin. "Don't believe me. Ask anyone down this street. Scout's a thief, sure, but he's got a nose for trouble. Seems to know when folks need something more than he does." Scout, as if to punctuate the sailor's words, stopped tugging the bag and sat upright, little hands resting on his belly. He turned his masked face toward Harris and let out a sharp, chittering cry. Harris laughed. "Hear that? He's sassing me for telling on him." Emily found herself smiling despite the heaviness of the day. Scout tilted his head, then scampered a few steps, tugging the bag again. The sack scraped across the asphalt, leaving a wet trail. Harris leaned forward on his cane. "You're new around here, ain't you? Never seen you before." "Emily Carter," she said quickly. "Moved in just before the flood." "Well, welcome to the madhouse," Harris said. "You'll find this town's got more stories than it has people, and that raccoon, he's in half of 'em." Scout stopped once more, releasing the sack. He padded over to a toppled trash bin at the edge of Harris's yard and stuck his head inside. A clatter followed, and when he re-emerged, he was wearing a plastic lid like a helmet. He shook it off, then batted it aside with a huff. Harris roared with laughter, slapping his knee. "See? Nuisance. But you can't stay mad at him." Emily laughed too, soft, uncertain, but genuine. The raccoon's antics were ridiculous, yet strangely endearing. Even in the shadow of destruction, he managed to draw a chuckle. Then, just as suddenly, Scout scampered back to the bag, seized it with his teeth, and pulled with renewed determination. He made it halfway up the cracked sidewalk before pausing to glance at Emily. It wasn't fear, not even curiosity. It was expectant, as though daring her to keep up. Harris leaned his weight on the fence, eyes narrowing with a knowing glint. "Looks like he's picked you out, Missy. Careful. Once Scout chooses you, there's no shaking him." Emily swallowed. "Chooses me for what?" The old sailor shrugged. "That's the thing. You don't find out till later. Could be trouble. Could be luck. Could be both." He tipped his cap. "But I'll tell you this. Whatever's in that bag, you'll want to see it. Scout don't drag junk around for no reason." Scout tugged the sack again, muscles in his short legs straining. The knot at the top bounced, water dripping down its sides. Emily stared, her curiosity turning into something sharper, almost urgent. She couldn't walk away now, not when everyone else acted like this was normal, and yet she could feel something unusual humming beneath the surface. Harris turned back to his yard, picking up a fallen branch with slow hands. Over his shoulder he called, "Keep your eyes open, Emily Carter. That critter's got a way of changing things." The words followed her as she stepped after Scout, the raccoon grunting and dragging his secret burden down the cracked sidewalk. Each scrape of the sack across the pavement echoed like a summons, pulling her deeper into a story she hadn't chosen, but one she already knew she couldn't escape. By the time Scout led her past the last row of mailboxes, the neighborhood thinned to a stretch of cottonwoods and a gravel lane that had washed into ruts. The raccoon kept to the high spots with an instinct for dry ground, hauling the burlap sack like a tiny, stubborn mule. Emily followed, breath misting in the cool air, jacket damp at the cuffs, a smear of river silt on her cheek where she'd brushed away a loose strand of hair. She told herself this was ridiculous, chasing a raccoon down a half-ruined street, but something about the creature's tenacity had a way of making nonsense feel like duty. The lane ended at a small frame house set back behind a leaning picket fence. The paint had once been blue. Now it was a tired gray, scabbed by weather. A rocking chair lay on its side, wedged against the porch steps. Sheets of plastic gleamed on the roof where shingles were gone. A hand-lettered sign in the front window read, "Back soon," though soon looked like it had been there a long while. Scout tugged the sack through the open gate and bumped it up each step with a series of determined little hops. At the top, he dropped it, sat up on his haunches, and rapped neatly on the screen door with his knuckles. Emily stopped at the bottom of the steps, unsure if she should laugh or run. Another rap, then a third, impatient, like a neighbor with a casserole and no time to spare. From inside came the scrape of a chair and a voice, low and rough around the edges. All right, I'm coming." The door creaked, and a man in his late 60s peered out. He was tall and a little stooped, with a carpenter's hands and a grey beard that grew where it pleased. His eyes, a soft blue, warmed when they landed on the Raccoon. "You again," he said, the words sighing into a smile. "And you brought something." Scout chirred, nose lifted as if to say, "Of course." The man unlatched the screen and stepped onto the porch. Seeing Emily, he paused, not wary so much as taking stock. "Afternoon," he said. "You with him?" I guess so," Emily answered, flustered at the absurdity. "He led me here. I'm Emily. I live a few blocks over." He nodded as if that squared everything. "Ethan Moore," he said, offering a hand that was calloused but gentle. "Good to meet you, Emily. Come on, then. If he invited you, you might as well see what the fuss is about." Ethan crouched and loosened the knot at the mouth of the sack. The cord was soaked and stubborn. Scout leaned in and picked at it with nimble fingers until it slipped free. Together, man and Raccoon peeled the wet burlap back. Inside lay a small trove. 2 dented cans of peaches, a tin of chili, a packet of crackers swaddled in a plastic bag, 3 bottles of water, and something soft and pale at the bottom, a folded baby blanket printed with faded blue clouds. Ethan blew out a breath, part laugh, part disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "That's my stash." He looked up at Emily, eyes shining with a private memory. "I put these in the shed before the river came up. Figured if the house flooded, we'd still have a few days' worth. Lost the shed when the creek broke its banks. Thought all this was carried off to Mississippi by now." He reached for the blanket last, turning it in his hands with a tenderness that made Emily step closer without thinking. The blue clouds were worn nearly smooth at the corners. "My boy Luke," Ethan said, his voice pitched low, as if he were speaking to himself. "We kept this for his little one. He and Jess moved out to Oklahoma last year. They'll be back when the roads are right." He pressed the blanket to his chest a moment, then laid it carefully over the chair arm to dry. Scout, apparently satisfied with the reaction, strutted to the edge of the porch and sat like a small foreman inspecting a finished job. Emily laughed under her breath. "He acts like he knew you needed that." Ethan scratched the Raccoon behind one ear, cautious and familiar. "Wouldn't surprise me," he said. "He's got a knack for turning up with precisely what you didn't know you were missing." He straightened and opened the door wider. "Coffee's on the stingy side lately, but I can heat some water. Come in and get the mud off your boots." Inside, the house smelled of cedar shavings and old books. Furniture had been pulled away from windows and stacked on paint cans. A workbench took up one wall of the living room, scattered with chisels and curls of pale wood. On a low shelf by the doorway sat a neat row of small carved animals. A fox, a heron, a dog with comically long ears. One, a raccoon, stood on its hind legs with a walnut between its hands. Expression carved so smart, it felt alive. Ethan noticed her looking. "Keeps my hands busy," he said. "Some men drink when the world gets heavy. I whittle." He set the cans on the table, fetched 2 chipped mugs, and lit a small camp stove on the counter. Scout hopped to a chair, then to the table, nosed the crackers, and glanced up at Ethan with the gravity of a diner inspecting the soup. "Mind your manners," Ethan told him mildly. Scout splayed his fingers into a pantomime of innocence and sat back, which made Emily laugh out loud. The sound surprised her, too bright against the day's gray edges. "How long have you known him?" she asked. "Found him as a pup," Ethan said, measuring powdered coffee with a pocket knife. "Winter storm, years back. He'd got himself into a trap behind my shop. Mean thing, welded shut with rust. Took me all afternoon to free him. Figured he'd bolt the minute I got it off." He smiled at the memory, poured hot water, and slid a mug toward her. "Instead, he came back that night and stole my socks off the porch. We've been arguing about ownership ever since." Emily cradled the mug, grateful for its heat. "People talk about him like he's more than a raccoon," she said, thinking of Harris's stories. "Like he knows when to show up." Ethan shrugged one shoulder, a quiet man's way of admitting to wonder. "I don't claim to understand it," he said. "But after Mary died, there were nights I couldn't make myself sleep in this house. Scout would rap on the door at 2 in the morning just to pick a fight with the broom. No real purpose I could see, but it got me laughing again. Sometimes that's all the saving a body needs." Through the window came the far-off thrum of a generator and the slap of a loose shutter. Emily sipped and felt the tight ring around her chest ease. She glanced at the baby blanket and the water bottles, at the raccoon now inching a cracker toward the table's edge with exaggerated innocence. "Don't you dare," Ethan warned. Scout froze, spread-fingered, then nudged the cracker back a hair, as if to prove how cooperative he could be when properly supervised. They ate peaches straight from the can, passing the spoon back and forth. Juice ran over Emily's knuckles, cold and sweet. When they were done, Ethan wiped the rim with a dish towel and tucked the empties in a crate labeled "for later." Scout, having earned his fee, curled in a patch of sun on the floorboards and snored in tiny whistles. "You're welcome here any time," Ethan said after a quiet stretch, as if the decision had been made long ago. "Neighbors are scarce when the water rises. A familiar face helps." Emily felt the word neighbor settle in her like a small, steadying weight. She wasn't ready to call this place home, not yet, but the doorway felt less like a threshold and more like a bridge. "Thank you," she said. "I should get back before dark. Power's still out on my block." Ethan walked her to the porch. Scout roused, made a soft trilling sound, and trotted ahead to the steps, where he picked up the emptied burlap sack with a proprietary air. He shook it once, as if testing its readiness for the next errand, and looked up at Emily, head cocked. "What's he going to do with that?" she asked, amused and a little wary of the answer. "Whatever he pleases," Ethan said, smiling. "But if I were you, I'd keep your porch light on, even if it's just a candle in the window. He has a way of checking on folks he brings to my door." Scout bounded down the steps and out through the crooked gate, the sack dragging behind him like a cape. At the sidewalk he paused, glanced back at them both, then set off at a brisk trot toward the heart of the battered neighborhood, humming with that same purpose that had drawn Emily from her porch at dawn. She stood a moment longer, listening to the scrape fade, feeling the odd tug of gratitude toward a creature she'd have set out a trash can for on any other day. Then she turned toward home, boots printing the damp dust, the river smell cleaner now, the sky diluting into late afternoon silver. Behind her, the old house sighed as the wind shifted, and inside it, a baby blanket with faded blue clouds began to dry on the arm of a chair. She didn't know the next turn the day would take, only that the line from her doorstep to Ethan's had been drawn by a small, masked face and a borrowed sack. Somehow, the town felt less like wreckage and more like a map, and the path ahead, while muddy and uncertain, ran not just away from the flood, but towards something she hadn't expected to find. The following morning dawned gray and sluggish, the kind of light that makes a man wonder if the sun has forgotten its business. Emily stood on her porch with a chipped mug of instant coffee and listened to the uneasy stillness of the neighborhood. Somewhere down the block, a hammer rang against wood. A child's voice shouted once, then fell quiet. The flood had left behind silence and weariness, the sort of quiet that gnaws at the edges of a person's spirit. She had hardly finished her coffee when a soft tapping came from the steps. Scout, the raccoon, sat there with the burlap sack folded beneath him like a cushion. He looked up at her with that bandit face, dark eyes bright, paws tucked neatly together as if waiting to be invited. Emily laughed despite herself. "You again?" she said. "You're not going to drag me across town this time, are you?" Scout trilled, hopped twice, and bounded toward the lane. Emily sighed, set down her cup, and followed. Her boots found the path as though it had been carved for her alone. When she reached Ethan Moore's house, the old carpenter was already outside, stacking damp wood by the porch. His back was bent, but his hands were steady, each log placed with quiet precision. He waved when he saw her. "Morning, Emily. Scout fetched you again?" "He seems to think I belong here," she admitted. "Maybe you do," Ethan said kindly. "Come sit a spell. There's more to him than meets the eye, and you might as well hear it from the start." They settled on the porch steps. Scout sprawled between them like a spoiled house cat, belly up, paws twitching. Ethan shook his head with mock reproach, then leaned his elbows on his knees. "It was near 12 years ago," he began. "We'd had a bad winter storm. Nothing like this flood, but enough to snap trees and cut the power for days. I was checking the back of my property when I heard a pitiful squealing. Found a young raccoon, barely more than a pup, caught in an old rusted trap some fool had left behind. Poor thing was half frozen, little paw chewed up. Should have called animal control, I guess, but Mary was still with me then, and she had a soft spot for strays. She said, 'Bring him in, we'll patch him up.' So I did." Ethan's eyes softened at the memory of his late wife. Emily stayed quiet, sensing the weight behind his words. "He stayed in a box by the stove for weeks," Ethan continued. "Mary fed him scraps, even warmed milk in a baby bottle. I kept saying we'd let him go once he was healed. But the trouble with promises like that is they keep shifting. By the time spring came, he was too clever for his own good. He'd follow me out to the shop, paw at my tools, even carry little bits of wood in his teeth. Thought he was my apprentice." Scout rolled to his side and yawned, as if confirming the story. Emily chuckled. "So he just stayed?" "Oh, he stayed and more. Stole socks, knocked over paint cans, dragged Mary's laundry into the yard like it was treasure. I tried building him a pen once, out back. Thought he'd be safer if he couldn't run wild. Well, he broke out before sundown, and when I got home, there he was on the porch roof, dropping clothespins on my head. I figured if he was smart enough to jailbreak, he was smart enough to make his own choices." The old man's smile faded a little. "Then Mary passed. Cancer, quiet, steady, like the tide going out. House felt emptier than I could bear, and every time I thought I'd drown in that quiet, I'd hear scratching at the door. Scout would be there, dragging something, sometimes useful, sometimes foolish. A jar lid, a hammer, a box of crackers he'd pilfered. He had a way of reminding me life goes on, even if it's messy." Emily felt her throat tighten. She looked at the raccoon, sprawled shamelessly across Ethan's boots, and tried to imagine the house without him. She couldn't. Just then, a thin whistle carried across the yard. Emily turned to see a boy about 9 years old hurrying up the lane, pant legs spattered with mud. He waved energetically. "Mr. Moore, Scout here again?" Ethan's face brightened. "Noah, come on over." The boy skidded to a halt at the gate, hair sticking up like a rooster. He grinned at Emily. "You're the new lady, huh? The one Scout brought last night?" Emily blinked. "Word gets around fast. Scout makes sure of it," Noah said proudly. "He's been my buddy since I was little. Once, when I lost my soccer ball, he carried it all the way to my porch. Course, he chewed it half flat first, but still." The boy laughed and knelt to scratch Scout's ears. "He's a thief, but he's our thief." Scout closed his eyes and leaned into the boy's hand. Emily smiled at the easy bond between them. "Does he always come around like this?" "Pretty much," Noah said. "Sometimes he shows up with weird stuff. One time he dragged my mom's shoe all the way from the riverbank. Another time he brought me a flashlight that actually worked. Dad said he probably stole it, but I didn't care." Ethan chuckled. "That's Scout for you. Mischief wrapped around a heart." He looked at Emily, more serious now. "You see why folks here let him be. He's no pet, but he's no ordinary wild thing either. He threads himself into our days like he's always belonged." Emily nodded slowly. And she thought of her own life, how she'd drifted into town like debris on the flood, unmoored, unknown. Watching Scout stretch his paws toward the sun, she wondered if maybe she was being threaded in too. The boy, Noah, lingered a few minutes more, telling tall tales about Scout chasing delivery trucks and stealing apples from the church picnic. Then his mother's voice called from down the lane, and he ran off, promising to return. When he was gone, the yard grew quiet again. Ethan leaned back against the railing. "Scout has a way of finding people who are lost," he said softly. "That was true for me. Maybe it's true for you." Emily felt the truth of it settle deep. She had followed out of curiosity, but now she sensed a pull stronger than logic. It wasn't just about the bag anymore. It was about the strange, uncanny way this raccoon stitched together lives frayed by loss. Scout rolled over and looked up at her, paws crossed on his chest as if waiting for her to decide something. Emily reached down, tentative, and brushed her fingers over his fur. He didn't flinch. Instead, he made a low, satisfied hum, the kind of sound you'd expect from a creature who already knew the answer. And in that quiet porch light, with the smell of wet earth rising from the yard and the flood scars all around, Emily realized she had stepped into a story that had begun long before she arrived, and one that would carry her far beyond anything she had imagined when she first spotted a raccoon dragging a heavy bag across a broken street. The floodwaters had begun to pull back, leaving behind a stink of mud and fish that clung to everything. By afternoon, the streets were streaked with pale lines where the water had receded, and folks were out again, dragging ruined couches and warped cabinets to the curb. The town had taken a beating, but it was still breathing. Emily spent the morning helping her closest neighbor sweep out her kitchen, but her thoughts kept circling back to Ethan's porch and the stories he had told her. By the time she headed home, Scout was waiting on her steps like he had been clocking her schedule. The burlap sack was gone this time, but his sharp little eyes were full of the same purpose. He trilled once, spun a circle, and darted off toward the river road. Emily groaned. "You're going to get me in trouble," she muttered, but she followed anyway. The path wound past downed trees and soggy lawns until the river glimmered through the cottonwoods. It no longer raged, but the current was quick, brown with silt, carrying broken branches like matchsticks. Scout scrambled ahead, pausing now and then to look back, urging her on. That was when she heard it, a faint cry, thin and frightened. At first she thought it was a bird, but the sound wavered into words. "Help! Somebody! Help me!" Emily's heart shot to her throat. She ran toward the voice, Scout bounding ahead. At the bend of the bank, she found Noah, the boy with the rooster hair, clinging to a low tree branch that jutted out over the water. His shoes were soaked, his jeans plastered to his legs, and terror was written plain on his small face. "Emily!" he cried when he saw her. "I slipped. I can't get back up." The branch he clung to sagged dangerously with his weight, the muddy bank crumbling each time he tried to shift. The current slapped at his sneakers, ready to pull him under. Emily's stomach twisted. She wasn't strong enough to wade in without being swept herself. She looked around wildly. No rope, no ladder, nothing. Then Scout leapt into action. The raccoon scrambled down the embankment, trilling sharp and loud, as though shouting orders. He darted to the edge of the branch, not close enough to weigh it down, but enough to draw Noah's eyes. The boy whimpered, but Scout chattered insistently, his little paws gesturing upward. Emily understood. "Noah, don't go down. Go up. Crawl toward the trunk." "I can't," his voice cracked. "It's too slippery." Scout scampered back to the trunk, climbed halfway, and dangled himself by his back legs, front paws scrabbling at the bark like he was demonstrating. Emily shouted encouragement. "See him. Do it like Scout. Use your knees. Don't think about falling. Just crawl." Noah whimpered again, but the raccoon's frantic display spurred him. He began inching toward the trunk, every movement trembling. The branch bent, splintering, but he reached out, clutching at bark just as it cracked behind him. For one sick heartbeat, Emily thought he'd fall. Then Ethan's voice rang out. "Hold on!" The old carpenter came striding through the trees. a coil of rope over his shoulder. He must have followed Scout's racket, for his eyes took in the scene in a blink. He tossed the rope around the trunk, tied it off with a sailor's knot that looked practiced, and scrambled partway down the slope with surprising speed for his years. "Grab hold, son," he commanded. Noah clutched the rope. Emily grabbed the tail end and braced her boots in the mud. Together they hauled until the boy was close enough for Ethan to snatch his collar and drag him onto solid ground. Noah collapsed, shaking but safe. Emily dropped to her knees beside him. "You're all right," she whispered, brushing wet hair from his forehead. "You're safe now." The boy clung to her sleeve, still sobbing. Scout perched on a root above them, tail twitching, as though he had orchestrated the whole thing. He gave a short chirp, then hopped down and nosed Noah's shoe, as if to check that it still had both feet inside. Ethan sank against the tree, breathing hard. "Lord above," he muttered. "That was too close." He turned to Scout. "And you? How in blazes did you know?" The raccoon only blinked, washing his paws like he had nothing to do with any of it. But Emily knew better. He had led her straight to Noah, cried loud enough for Ethan to come running, and even shown the boy how to climb. Mischief or not, Scout had saved his life. By the time they walked Noah home, word had already spread. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispers trailing behind them like smoke. The raccoon found him? Dragged the lady right to him? Didn't I tell you Scout had sense? Noah's mother met them at the gate, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pulled her son into her arms. "Thank you," she cried to Emily and Ethan. Then she looked down at the raccoon at her feet. "And thank you too, you little bandit." Scout sat back on his haunches, licking one paw with exaggerated dignity, as though the praise was only his due. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the boy dangling over the water, the rope creaking, Ethan's hands straining. But more than anything, she saw Scout's sharp little face turned toward her, urging her to understand, to act. She realized then that Harris had been right. This raccoon had a nose for people in trouble. He had found Ethan when grief hollowed him out, and he had found Noah before the river could take him. And now, for reasons Emily couldn't yet name, he kept finding her. By morning, the town was buzzing the way a beehive does when somebody lifts the lid. News of Noah's near fall and the raccoon that raised the alarm had run down the streets faster than the floodwater ever did. Folks who hadn't spoken to one another in months were suddenly stopping at the corner to trade the story, adding little twists like pepper. How Scout had pointed like a hunting dog, how he'd trilled like a whistle, how he'd dangled from a tree to show the boy how to climb. By noon, that little bandit had a promotion. People were calling him a hero. Emily heard pieces of it as she and Ethan hauled a mildewed couch to the curb. Her back ached, her gloves were slick with rot, but her heart felt light in a way she couldn't explain. Every so often she caught Ethan smiling to himself, a quiet, private thing that made the lines at his eyes look softer. Scout wandered the block like a small mare on inspection. He nosed at boxes, hopped onto porch rails, peered into tool buckets as if checking inventory. When a stack of warped photo albums teetered, he reached a careful paw and steadied it, then looked around to see if anyone had noticed his helpfulness. Emily did. She gave him a solemn nod, and he answered with a smug little hum. Around mid-afternoon, a church group from upstate rolled in with a charcoal grill strapped to a trailer. The pastor, a round man with a sunburned neck, called out that they'd be serving hot dogs on the elementary school lot once the coals were ready. "Bring what you've got," he said. "We'll eat it before it spoils." Kids cheered. Grown-ups tried not to. After a week of cold cans and crackers, the thought of something hot drew people like a tune draws dancers. By the time the grill smoked, the basketball court had turned into a picnic. Card tables appeared from nowhere. Someone set out a jar of pickles. Mrs. Poole from the post office produced a pan of cornbread that had somehow survived the outage. Laughter returned to the air in little bursts, unsure at first, then stronger. Emily walked over with Ethan, both of them trailing mud like extra footprints. Scout padded between them, tail ringed and jaunty as if escorting dignitaries. He made his presence known in the first 3 minutes. While the pastor bowed his head to bless the food, Scout eased a paw onto the edge of the table and inched a hot dog bun toward himself with the patience of a safecracker. A boy spotted him and hissed, "Hey!" Scout froze, eyes wide with innocence, then, ever so carefully, pushed the bun back a half-inch like he was merely straightening the tablecloth. The boy snorted, lost his solemnity, and the prayer ended with laughter instead of "Amen." Word about the rescue circled and closed around Emily and Ethan faster than they could shake hands. "You were there? Did he really lead you? Was Noah in the water?" Emily told the story 3 times and felt it grow truer with each telling, not because the facts changed, but because her own understanding of them deepened. When she first saw Scout at the riverbank, she'd thought it was a miracle with fur on. Now she thought it was something quieter and just as holy, attention paid at the right moment. Noah arrived last, his mother's arm looped tight around his shoulders. The boy's hair was flattened and clean, but his shoes were new and too bright, a telltale sign of yesterday's scare. He walked straight to Scout, knelt and hugged him without asking permission. Scout accepted the honor like a veteran receiving a medal, grave for a full 2 seconds, then licking the boy's ear just to make him squeal. A young relief worker in a reflective vest crouched nearby, eyes wide. "I've seen tornado damage, ice storms, a wildfire out west," he said to Emily, "but I've never seen a town give a standing ovation to a raccoon." "You haven't met this one," she answered, and surprised herself by the pride in her voice. The pastor, moved by sentiment and spectacle, tapped a spoon against a cooler. "Neighbors," he called, "I hear we owe thanks to a small friend with a big heart." He gestured grandly. "Son, bring him up." Noah scooped Scout like a sack of potatoes, which Scout tolerated only because the applause went to his head. On the table stood a paper crown. Someone had folded it from a grocery bag, lettered in marker, "Accidental Hero." The pastor set it gently between Scout's ears. The raccoon sat perfectly still, eyes sparkling, as if aware that any sudden move would ruin the moment. The crown slid to one side and stuck there. The crowd whooped. A woman from 2 streets over raised a practical concern. "He's still a wild animal," she said. "We shouldn't let kids hand-feed him." "Agreed," Ethan replied before anyone else could divide into camps. "He comes and goes on his own terms. We let him be. We keep our distance when we should, and we thank him kindly when he does us a good turn." He looked at Noah, then at the gathering. "Respect goes both ways." That settled it more sensibly than any debate would have. People stepped in closer, not to pet, but to see, to smile, to let themselves believe in something small and brave. Scout accepted the admiration until he decided the ceremony had dragged on long enough. He hopped down, strutted along the tables like a parade marshal, and, because a raccoon must be true to his nature, stole an entire slice of cornbread with a flourish. He sat in the center of the court, holding it in both hands, nibbling like a drummer at a snare. Crumbs dusted his whiskers. When Emily scolded, "Manners," he delicately licked each finger, then offered her the last bite, as if to say, "We share in this town, don't we?" Twilight slid in with pink edges, and the flood-scarred streets took on a gentler face under the schoolyard lights. Music sputtered from a battery speaker. Old country, the kind that knows every mile between grief and laughter. Mr. Harris the sailor shuffled over with his cane and told anyone who'd listen that Scout once liberated a peach pie and left the tin cleaned so fine you could shave in it. The kids howled. The widowers nodded with the soft eyes of men who've known good mischief and missed it. Emily found herself on a blanket beside Ethan and Noah, paper plates balanced on their knees. Her shoulders loosened for the first time in weeks. She looked around at the circle. Neighbors she'd barely met now leaning close, swapping phone numbers, promising ladders and generators and hands. She felt the click of belonging, like a door latching in a safe wind. Scout finished his cornbread, ambled back, and curled at Emily's side without ceremony. He set his chin on her boot and closed his eyes, the picture of a creature who knew where he was wanted. Ethan watched with that same quiet smile. "Seems he's claimed you," he said. "I'm not sure I deserve him," Emily answered softly. "None of us do," Ethan said. That's the marvel of it. Across the court, the relief worker lifted his phone to take a picture and then thought better of it, lowering the device like a man putting his hat back on in church. "Some things," he murmured, "you just keep in your chest." The crown, crooked and ridiculous, still sat on Scout's head. Noah adjusted it with the solemnity of a page at a coronation. Scout tolerated the fuss for another minute, then shook once. The crown tumbled, sailed, and landed square on Emily's lap. Laughter rolled through the little crowd. She picked it up and set it beside her, an ordinary paper thing made precious by the hands that had handled it. As the first stars pricked through the low Arkansas sky, Emily felt the day settle into a memory she knew would last. Smoke and laughter, muddy shoes lined like soldiers, a boy safe because a small creature had paid attention, an old man whose eyes were clear again, and a raccoon asleep with one paw resting lightly against her ankle like a promise. They would all go home soon. The lights would blink out one by one. The town would creak and breathe and begin, truly begin, to heal. And somewhere in that healing, Scout would lift his masked face, hear a shutter bang loose or a child cry out, and go where he was needed next. For tonight, though, he stayed put. Accidental hero, shameless thief, the little thread holding a rough fabric together, purring a sound so soft Emily felt it more than heard it, like the hum of a heart that has decided to keep on. The night of the cookout left the little town humming with a new kind of warmth. For the first time since the river had spilled its banks, folks went to bed with full bellies and tired smiles. Emily lay awake in her small rental house, listening to the frogs reclaiming the ditches and the distant drone of a generator. Her boots were still muddy by the door, her jacket still damp with smoke from the fire, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She had come here a stranger, but now there were faces tied to her name, laughter stitched to her memory. And at the center of it all was a masked little trickster who had carried more than just a bag through the flood. Scout was gone when she rose the next morning. The yard was quiet except for the drip of dew off the porch rail. She half expected him to be perched on her steps again, waiting with another summons. Instead, she found only a trail of paw prints in the mud, leading away toward the old part of town. Something in her chest tugged. By midday, she was back at Ethan's, helping him nail a tarp tighter across the roof. The sun was sharp, and sweat ran down her temples. They worked in companionable silence until Ethan straightened with a groan and pointed down the lane. "Well, look who's returned." Scout trotted toward them, dragging the burlap sack once again. This time, though, it bulged in an odd, lumpy shape. He heaved it up the porch steps, dropped it with a grunt, and sat back proudly. Emily crouched, curious, and untied the cord. Inside, she found a bundle of things. 2 more cans of food, a half-used roll of duct tape, and, laid on top, as if it were treasure, a knitted scarf, frayed but neatly folded. Ethan's breath caught. He reached in and lifted it gently, fingers trembling. "Mary's," he whispered. The yarn was pale yellow, worn thin where his late wife's hands had handled it most. "I thought the water carried this off for good." He pressed it to his face, and his shoulders shook once, twice, before he steadied himself. Emily swallowed against the lump in her throat. She touched the edge of the scarf. "He brought it back to you." Ethan nodded slowly. "Or maybe he brought it to us," he said, glancing at her with eyes damp but steady. Scout's got a way of knowing who needs reminding. Scout chirped as if in agreement, then scrambled onto the porch rail and surveyed them both, tail twitching like a banner. Mischief, yes, but something else glimmered in his dark eyes. Something weightier than the scarf or the cans of food. That afternoon, as neighbors came by to check on one another, the story of the scarf spread like fire through dry grass. Folks who had shrugged at Scout before now looked at him with reverence, whispering about omens and providence. "He doesn't just steal," one woman said. "He returns what matters." Toward evening, the town gathered again in small knots, this time not for food, but for talk, for comfort. Children played tag around piles of debris. Men leaned on shovels, women traded recipes and worries in equal measure. Emily stood among them, feeling less like an outsider with every nod and smile. Scout, ever the opportunist, made the rounds. He pawed at a cooler, stole a grape from a salad bowl, even climbed onto a truck bed to investigate a toolbox. People laughed, shooed him gently, but no one chased him off. It was as if he had been given honorary citizenship. As the sky bruised purple, Emily drifted to the edge of the crowd. She thought of the bag, of burdens carried, losses dragged through mud, and the surprising gifts hidden inside. She thought of herself too, of the grief she had hauled from her broken marriage, the loneliness that had sat like a stone on her chest. She had come here looking for peace, but what she had found was heavier and better, belonging. Ethan joined her, scarf still looped around his neck, though the night was warm. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, voice low. "All of us thought we were drowning. Turns out we just needed reminding that we're not alone." Emily nodded. Scout knew. "Scout always knows," Ethan said with a smile. At that moment, the raccoon padded over and sat squarely against Emily's leg. He looked up at her, then leaned his head into her knee with the weight of trust. She froze, then lowered a hand, hovering an inch above his fur. When he didn't move, she let her palm settle gently on his back. The warmth of him, alive and unafraid, spread through her like a balm. The neighbors noticed. Someone chuckled softly. Someone else whispered, "Looks like he's chosen her." Emily felt her cheeks heat, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she scratched lightly behind his ear, and Scout closed his eyes, humming a little trill of satisfaction. The voices of the town swelled around them. Stories retold, laughter breaking, songs rising as someone strummed a guitar. The stars wheeled out overhead, clear for the first time since the storm. And in that gathering of the scarred and the weary, Emily felt the last edges of her loneliness soften. Scout lifted his head once, gave her a look that seemed to hold the whole town in it, then settled again, content. The burdens he carried, sacks of cans, scraps of cloth, a scarf, a blanket, were symbols, she realized, of the burdens they all carried. And like him, they discovered that when shared, those burdens became gifts. Home, she thought, isn't a place you stumble into. It's the moment you realize you don't have to carry the heavy bag alone. Scout trilled again, as if agreeing, and the sound threaded through the night like a promise. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. It's that easy. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next unbelievable story waiting just around the corner.